Welcome and welcome back. We are here for the third part, as I did decide to break down chapter 2. We are here for the third part in the series as we journey along through Leonardo da Vinci, as it is presented to us by Walter Isaacson. This is chapter 2, Apprentice. We will be going over sections The Move through Pageants and Plays. It really helps me out on the channel. If you see anything of value in this video, if you go ahead and hit that like button for me, and if you were finding me for the first time and you want to stick around for things such as this, hitting that subscribe button as well. So we're going to set the stage a little bit here on The Move, just a little bit of the flavor of what it was like in Leonardo's world at this time. The Move, from page 23. Until he was 12, Leonardo had a life in Vinci that, despite the complexities of being part of an extended family, was quite settled. He lived primarily with his grandparents and his idle uncle Francesco in the family house in the heart of Vinci. His father and stepmother were listed as living there when Leonardo was 5, but after that their primary residence was in Florence. Leonardo's mother and her husband lived with their growing brood of children, along with Ecatabriga's parents and his brother's family in a farmhouse an easy walk from town. But at 12, Leonardo is getting of the age where he needs to start wondering about his future and setting plans for a career. He needs to learn a trade, and that is what Florence was for. And we get on 25 and 26 here, under the subheading Florence, surprise, surprise. There was no place then, and a few places ever, that offered a more stimulating environment for creativity than Florence in the 1400s. Its economy, once dominated by unskilled wool spinners, had flourished by becoming one that, like our own time, interwove art, technology, and commerce. It featured artisans working with silk makers and merchants to create fabrics that were works of art. In 1472, there were 84 wood carvers, 83 silk workers, 30 master painters, and 44 goldsmiths and jewelry craftsmen working in Florence. That's a hell of a city, especially for the mid-late 1400s. It was also a center of banking. The florin, noted for its gold purity, was the dominant standard of currency in all of Europe, and the adoption of double-entry bookkeeping that recorded debits and credits permitted commerce to flourish. Its leading thinkers embraced the Renaissance humanism that put its faith in the dignity of the individual and in the aspiration to find happiness on this earth. On this earth. Very important. Through knowledge. Fully a third of Florence's population was literate, the highest rate in Europe. By embracing trade, it became the center of finance and a cauldron of ideas. One would be remiss not to make a comparison, at least, to New York in today's world, with all of these different craftsmen, all of these different art seekers in the same place. But art was very different then than it is today. Still, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this video, but still, one of the things that we're talking about here is the importance of the individual and earthly happiness. These are things that, when you're talking about happiness on earth, unlike the Dark Ages, where everything was sacrificed for the afterlife, finding happiness on earth, wanting happiness on earth, wanting knowledge, wanting all of these things that were a little bit of a different animal in the Middle Ages, leads to a whole lot of prosperous stuff, especially for, again, putting the emphasis on the individual. Going back to page 23, Leonardo rarely wrote in his notebooks about his own emotions, so it is hard to know what he felt about the move. But the fables he recorded sometimes give a glimpse of his sentiments. One One described the sad odyssey of a stone perched on a hill, surrounded by colorful flowers and a grove of trees. In other words, a place like Vinci. Looking at the crowd of stones along the road below, it decided it wanted to join them. Quote, "What am I doing here among these plants?" the stone asked. "I don't want to live in the company of my fellow stones." So it rolled down to the others. After a while, Leonardo recounted, it found itself in continual distress from the wheels of the carts, the other the wheels of the carts, the iron hoofs of horses, and the feet of passers-by. One rolled it over another and trod upon it. Sometimes the stone raised itself up a little as it lay, covered with mud or the dung of some animal. But it was in vain that it looked up at the spot whence it had come as a place of solitude and tranquil peace. End quote. Leonardo drew a moral. Quote, "This is what happens to those who leave a life of solitary contemplation to choose to come to dwell in cities among people full of infinite evil." So there seems to be, even at this time, even at this stage in his life, some consternation about leaving little old home, Vinci, and finding success in the big city, Florence. I think that this is going to prove. So Leonardo did not seem, from my understanding, to relish anywhere that he lived, but he was not afraid to make the most of anywhere that he lived. So if he found himself in the countryside, he's going to make the most of it. If he found himself in the big city, he's going to make the most of it. If he found himself in the care of some wealthy merchant, etc., banker, etc., he's going to make the most of it. That seemed to be one of the things that was most compelling about Leonardo. And when we talk about finding himself in the care of someone else's employ, if you will, we have these quotes from page 27, about Florence as well. Unlike some city-states elsewhere in Italy, Florence was not ruled by hereditary royalty. More than a century before Leonardo had arrived, the most prosperous merchants and guild leaders crafted a republic. The republic was not, however, democratic or egalitarian. In fact, it was barely a republic. Exercising power from behind the facade was the Medici family, the phenomenally wealthy bankers who dominated Florentine politics and culture during the 15th century. Skipping a little further down, they were innovators in bookkeeping, including the use of debit and credit accounting that became one of the great spurs to progress during the Renaissance. By means of payoffs and plotting, Cosimo became the de facto ruler of Florence, and his patronage made it the cradle of Renaissance art and humanism. But when we're talking about humanism, it is important that the Medicis really seem to have considered themselves, to some extent, above God, above the law, above the rules, above any of the norms of the day, because they were not afraid to employ a bastard such as Leonardo. Because we get this back on page 24 into 25, there is one significant thing that Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, did not do, which would have been easy enough for a well-connected notary: go through the legal process of having his son legitimated. This could be accomplished by the father and the child appearing before the local official known as a Count Palatine, usually a dignitary who had been granted power to act on such matters, and presenting a petition to the child knelt. Piero's decision not to do this for Leonardo is particularly surprising, since he then had no other children of his own. This, I think, becomes crucial to someone's idea of themselves. My father has the ability to make me legitimate and chooses not to. This worked out to Leonardo's advantage, as he was not expected to follow in the footsteps of his father and become a notary, leaving him free to pursue his art. But, boy, it sure makes things a gamble. It sure makes things a gamble for a very long time in Leonardo's life. Not only that, imagine, and sure, we're approaching this with modern sentiments, so maybe things felt, quote unquote, a little bit different back then, but I can't imagine that they did. Imagine your father deciding, I don't really care. I'm not going to make him my son. I'm going to let the whole world know this is not my legitimate heir. That'll put a chip on your shoulder. A chip on your shoulder that makes you extremely motivated. This seems to be the way. So a chip like that can do one of two things. That chip can spread and crack the entire individual, or an individual can work hard to fill that chip in. Leonardo was the hard-working type. He worked hard enough to find himself an artistic master known as Verrocchio. This comes to us from page 33. Around the time Leonardo was 14, his father was able to secure for him an apprenticeship with one of his clients, Andrea del Verrocchio, a versatile artist and engineer who ran one of the best workshops in Florence. Vasari wrote, Vasari, who was an early biographer of Leonardo. I have that biography, thank you, Monse. Piero took some of his drawings and carried them to Andrea del Verrocchio, who was his good friend, and asked if he thought it would be profitable for the boy to study drawing. Piero knew Verrocchio very well, and he notarized at least 4 legal settlements and a rental document for him around this time. But Verrocchio probably gave the boy an apprenticeship on merit, not just as a favor to his father. He was, Vasari reported, astonished at the boy's talent. Verrocchio's bottega, like those of his 5 or 6 main competitors in Florence, was more like a commercial shop, similar to the shops of the cobblers and jewelers along the street than a refined art studio. On the ground floor was a store and a workroom open to the street, where the artisans and apprentices mass-produced products from their easels, workbenches, kilns, pottery wheels, and metal grinders. Many of the workers lived and ate together in the quarters upstairs. The paintings and their objects were not signed. They were not intended to be works of individual expression. This is the world from which Leonardo was coming. Most were collaborative efforts, including many of the paintings commonly attributed to Verrocchio himself. The goal was to produce a constant flow of marketable art and artifacts, rather than nurture creative geniuses yearning to find outlets for their originality. This is interesting. Imagine, so you're living in a world where art is so valuable that everyone wants some of it just as a status symbol. You're not, however, living in a world where it is so valuable that you care from whom it came. So imagine, the only way I can think to reconceptualize this is imagine if music couldn't be duplicated, right? It could be recorded once. You could record on vinyl one time. And we lived in a culture that loved music so much that you always had to have music playing in your home as a status symbol. Imagine all of the or the garage bands constantly cranking out music just so that people could have it. That's the only way I can really think of this. That's one thing that paragraph. That's one way that paragraph strikes me. Just that weird take on art. I want to have some art in my house, but I don't care that it's breathtaking enough that it's from a master. Just give me some stuff. It's understandable in a day before prints, right? You couldn't print something out. You couldn't have a mass-produced picture of Patrick Mahomes on your wall or whatever. But art was not highly individualized. It was not. You weren't looking for a piece from Leonardo. You were looking for a painting to have in your house, and you could resell them at will because it didn't matter. You didn't have to paint it to sell it, right? So there was this market of art that was being mass produced. It's a strange concept in today's world. When all the stuff that is that sort of disposable is printed out, right? The other thing that it makes me think of is there is a when you're talking about artists from this time period, slightly before this time period, like Donatello, through Caravaggio, you're talking about a lot of artists who do their own take on things. Sort of like how there's 14 different versions of Christmas songs. Everyone has their own take on things. Michael Bublé has a take on this Christmas song. The old crooners have their take on that Christmas song, yada, yada, yada. In the painting world, this is the Pieta. This is the Assumption of Mary. This is all of these different scenes from the Bible. Everyone has a take on it, right? Because someone would say, I want an Assumption of Mary. It's important to me. So you have that scene that you paint. It's interesting. It is a different concept than the concept that we have today, where our culture has not stumbled upon, but inherited. Our culture has inherited all of the great artists from the past, right? In this day, in Leonardo's day, so Donatello, one of the things for which Donatello was famous was his David, I think. Which, another thing, everybody has a David, right? I think it was Donatello that was famous for his David. There's only one of those. Nobody's got a picture of it. There's only one of those. And no one has a picture of it. No one's got the internet. So everyone, you want to see a David, somebody in your town has to do the David. Somebody in your town has to purchase the David. So it's interesting. The commoditization of these things, while they are still rare, it's a paradox almost. It's strange to think about. It's strange to think about. But moving forward, Leonardo had studied the use of math for commercial purposes at his abacus school, but from Verrocchio he learned something more profound, the beauty of geometry. After Cosimo de' Medici died, Verrocchio designed a marble and a bronze slab for his tomb, which was finished in 1467, a year after Leonardo became his apprentice. Instead of religious imagery, the tomb slab featured geometrical patterns dominated by a circle inside a square, as Leonardo would use for his famous drawing, Vitruvian Man. Inside the design, Verrocchio and his workshop carved carefully proportioned rectangles and half circles in colors that were based on harmonic ratios and the Pythagorean musical scale. There was harmony in proportions, Leonardo learned, and math was nature's brushstroke. Here we have the budding of what is the Renaissance man. This is an artist who is employing science. This is an artist who is employing mathematics. There were any number of crafts at this time which were learning to prosper in a similar way. This is from whence the term Renaissance man comes. This idea that all ideas can collaborate. All of these things can come back around and be synergistic. And also, on his growing as an artist, for Leonardo, the drapery so Leonardo was renowned and is still renowned for his studies of different fabrics. If you can find Leonardo's fabric studies or drapery studies, they're worth a look because it's mind-blowing what the guy could do with a couple pencils, a couple slabs of charcoal, and a piece of vellum or paper or whatever it was he was drawing on. Page 40. For Leonardo, the drapery studies helped foster one of the key components of his artistic genius, the ability to deploy light and shade in ways that would better produce the illusion of three-dimensional volume on a two-dimensional surface. They also helped him hone his ability to observe how light subtly caresses an object, causing a glistening of luster, a sharpened contrast on a fold, or a hint of reflected glow creeping into the heart of a shadow. The first intention of the painter, Leonardo later wrote, is to make a flat surface display a body as if modeled and separated from this plane, and he who surpasses others in this skill deserves most praise. This accomplishment, with which the science of painting is crowned, arises from light and shade, or as we may say, chiaroscuro. That statement could stand at his artistic manifesto, or at least a key element of it. Later on that page 41, when mastering drapery drawings in Verrocchio's studio, Leonardo also pioneered sfumato, the technique of blurring contours and edges. It is a way for artists to render objects as they appear to our eye rather than with sharp contours. This advance caused Vasari to proclaim Leonardo the inventor of the, quote, modern manner, end quote, in painting. And the art historian Ernst Gombrich recalled sfumato, Leonardo's famous invention. He blurred the outline in mellowed colors that allow one form to merge with another and always leave something to our imagination, end quote. This is Leonardo, young Leonardo, coming up with ways by which he could absolutely revolutionize his art form. This is what genius does. This is where genius comes from. This is why it is necessary to study the great people. What are you doing in your life that you could revolutionize in the way that someone like Leonardo revolutionizes things? It's interesting to ask those questions when reading about great people. From where do they get the idea to just say, fuck it, I'm going to do it my own way? Or, hey, you know what? When you're looking at something, everything in the background sort of blends together. So, if, in a painting, I go ahead and focus for the audience on what it is I want them to look at, then they will have to look where I tell them. which is ultimately the goal of a visual artist. Maybe that's not fair. Not ultimately the goal, but ultimately the practice of the visual artist. So yeah, but there is one small thing left to talk about in this chapter. It happens on page 32 that I found. So the best thing about biographies is they allow you into the life of someone. Normally, if it's a biography, it's going to be one of these great people. You're reading about a great person. And why do you want to read about them? You want to read about them to sort of reverse engineer anything you can, right? That's what you're really doing in there, trying to reverse engineer anything you can to incorporate it in your own life. Hopefully, there's some element of that to what you're doing. But I think also the reason we read about other people is to notice something of ourselves in there. And if you're here on the channel and you watch any of my goal setting series here, you'll see some of the goals that I set, and this will sound pretty familiar. Something algebra that didn't exist at the time, nor did he learn Latin. In his 30s, he would still be trying to remedy this deficiency by drawing up lists of Latin words, painstakingly writing out awkward translations and wrestling with grammar rules. Yeah, I'm still doing that, trying to get little bits of other languages. Also, he was left-handed. That next paragraph starts with a left-hander. Leonardo wrote from right to left on the page. Something that is interesting to see, but ultimately not all that interesting in a biography. That is all I have for this video. Next video, we're going to round out chapter 2, which is the Apprentice, which will last us through page 67, and then we'll start on chapter 3 called On His Own. So I really appreciate you being here. If you made it this far in the video, it really helps me out if you do hit that like button. I will be back. I am here on this channel Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I know it's been a little bit hairy lately, but I have my reasons. I worked 14 days straight at work with a lot of overtime on the edges of the shifts, not just in the extra shifts, if you know what I mean. So it's just murder. So I will be more regular going forward. I am also on my second channel, Strip Cover Lit, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Mondays are for poetry. I hope to see you back here, and I hope to see you back there next time.